The mall was a hub of opulence and activity. The bright lights from high-end store windows reflected off the polished marble floors, creating a dazzling spectacle that matched the luxury of its clientele. Designer brands lined the walkways, their displays showcasing the latest collections. Glittering watches, sleek handbags, and outfits tailored to perfection. The hum of casual conversations mingled with the soft strains of instrumental music, setting a tone of exclusivity. Shoppers strolled through the wide corridors, their bags laden with expensive purchases. A couple debated over which luxury watch to buy, while a group of teenagers giggled in excitement, clutching shopping bags from popular brands. The scent of fresh brewed coffee wafted through the air as people lingered near the cafe, sipping lattes and scrolling through their phones. In the middle of it all, James stood quietly in front of a store window, observing the display of sleek leather shoes. He was a striking figure, not because of flashy clothing or loud behavior, but because of his calm, self-assured presence. He wore a simple but neatly pressed button-up shirt, dark jeans, and well-kept sneakers. His posture was relaxed, yet there was an air of quiet confidence about him that seemed to make some people glance twice. James wasn't rushing. He studied the shoes carefully, his expression thoughtful, as though weighing more than just their price tag. Nearby, an employee adjusted items on a shelf, glancing at James with a hint of curiosity. Across the walkway, 2 mall security guards leaned against a railing, watching the crowd. One of them, Officer Bradley, was a burly man with sharp, darting eyes and an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. He scanned the shoppers like a hawk, his lips curling slightly at anyone who didn't fit his image of belonging. "Hey, check him out," Bradley said, nudging his partner, Officer Davis, a younger and quieter guard. He nodded toward James. Davis followed his gaze but hesitated. "What about him?" he asked, his tone uncertain. Bradley smirked. "Guy like that doesn't come here to shop," he said, his voice low but filled with implication. "He's been standing there too long, just looking, probably casing the place." Davis shifted uncomfortably. "He could just be browsing," he suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. Bradley scoffed. "Browsing? In a place like this? Dressed like that?" He adjusted his belt and pushed off the railing. "Come on, let's make sure he knows this isn't his neighborhood." Davis followed reluctantly, his steps slower than Bradley's. As they approached, James glanced at them briefly before returning his attention to the display. "Sir," Bradley said, his tone sharp. "Do you need help with something?" James turned to them fully, his expression polite but calm. "No, thank you," he said. "I'm just looking." Bradley narrowed his eyes. "You've been standing here for a while," he said, his voice edged with suspicion. "We've had some trouble with people loitering and causing problems. You're not planning to cause any trouble, are you?" James raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unshaken. "No," he replied simply. "I'm not." Davis shifted awkwardly, glancing at Bradley and then at James. "Maybe he's just shopping," he said quietly. Bradley ignored him. "If you're not buying anything," he continued, "you might want to move along. We don't want people lingering too long." James tilted his head slightly, studying Bradley with a steady gaze. "I didn't realize there was a time limit for looking at shoes," he said, his tone neutral. Bradley bristled, his posture stiffening. "It's mall policy," he said, though his voice faltered slightly under James's calm scrutiny. A few passers-by began to slow their steps, their curiosity piqued by the exchange. Among them was a young child holding their parent's hand. The child tugged on their parent's sleeve and asked, "Mom, why are they talking to him like that?" The parent hesitated, glancing at the scene with a mixture of discomfort and uncertainty. "I'm not sure, sweetheart," they said, gently steering the child away. James noticed the interaction, his gaze briefly flickering to the child before returning to the guards. "Am I making someone uncomfortable?" he asked quietly. Bradley crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "It's our job to keep this mall safe," he said, "and we can't have people hanging around looking suspicious." James's expression didn't change, but his words carried a subtle weight. "Suspicious," he repeated. "And what exactly about me is suspicious?" Bradley hesitated for a fraction of a second before recovering. "We're just following protocol," he said, his tone defensive. "Now, are you planning to buy something or not?" The crowd around them grew slightly larger, whispers spreading as more shoppers noticed the interaction. A woman near the back pulled out her phone, holding it up discreetly to record. The tension in the air was palpable. "I haven't decided yet," James said, his voice steady. "But I didn't realize I needed to explain myself to security while shopping." Davis cleared his throat, his discomfort evident. "Maybe we should just let him be," he said quietly to Bradley. Bradley shot him a glare. "If you don't want to do your job, go take a break," he snapped. "I'll handle this." James remained composed, his calm demeanor only serving to highlight Bradley's growing irritation. "If you think I'm doing something wrong," James said evenly, "then by all means, call the manager. Or the police." The quiet challenge in his tone seemed to unnerve Bradley, though he didn't show it. Instead, he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Don't push your luck," he said. At that moment, a store employee stepped forward hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice shaky. "Is there a problem here?" Bradley turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "No problem," he said. "Just making sure everything's in order." The employee glanced at James, her eyes lingering on him for a moment. There was something familiar about him, though she couldn't quite place it. "If he's just looking," she said carefully, "then I don't see an issue." Bradley's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. "Fine," he said, stepping back slightly. "But we'll be keeping an eye on things." The crowd began to disperse slowly, though a few people lingered, their curiosity still piqued. James turned back to the display, his calm demeanor unchanged, though there was a faint glint in his eyes that suggested he wasn't entirely unaffected. As Bradley and Davis walked away, the younger guard glanced over his shoulder at James. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. Bradley didn't answer immediately. "Just stay alert," he said finally. "Something about that guy doesn't sit right with me." Back at the store, James continued browsing, his movements unhurried. But there was an air of tension around him now, as though he could feel the weight of the guard's eyes on his back. And though the crowd had mostly dispersed, one question lingered in the air. Who was James, really? The tension in the air remained thick, even as the initial crowd dispersed. Those who had witnessed the interaction between James and the mall's security guards carried whispers of curiosity and speculation with them, which rippled outward, drawing more eyes to the unfolding drama. James lingered outside the luxury store, his composure unbroken. He leaned casually against the polished railing of the second floor, gazing down at the bustling mall below. From this vantage point, he could see the ebb and flow of people, parents chasing after children, couples strolling arm in arm, and sales associates enticing passers-by with the latest deals. But James wasn't looking at the crowd. His calm demeanor and steady gaze suggested he was waiting for something, or someone. Across the walkway, Officer Bradley's irritation continued to simmer. He watched James with narrowed eyes, the earlier confrontation playing in his mind like a stubborn echo. Bradley was the kind of man who thrived on control, and James's unbothered attitude grated on him. "He's still here," Bradley muttered, nudging his partner. Officer Davis, leaning against the wall, shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe he's just waiting for someone," he suggested. "We've already questioned him. Why not leave it alone?" Bradley shot him a glare. "Because something about this guy doesn't add up," he said. "And I don't like loose ends." Davis hesitated but said nothing. He'd learned quickly that challenging Bradley's instincts wasn't worth the backlash, especially in a setting where the senior officer's word carried weight. Bradley adjusted his belt and stepped forward, his stride purposeful as he approached James for the third time that afternoon. The slight scuff of his boots against the polished tile was barely audible over the hum of the mall, but James noticed him immediately. James turned his head slightly, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. "Back again?" he asked, his tone polite but pointed. Bradley stopped a few feet away, crossing his arms over his chest. "You've been hanging around here for a while now," he said. "Just looking. Not buying anything. It's suspicious." James raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious," he repeated, the word rolling off his tongue as though he were testing its weight. "And what crime have I committed by standing in one place?" Bradley ignored the question, his stance rigid. "People don't just hang around luxury stores for no reason," he said. "So, why are you here?" James held his gaze for a moment, then turned his attention back to the railing as if dismissing Bradley's presence entirely. "Maybe I just like watching people," he said simply. The response seemed to infuriate Bradley, whose jaw tightened visibly. "We don't have time for games," he said, his voice lowering. "If you're not here to shop, I suggest you move along." James turned back to him, his expression unchanging. "Or what?" he asked quietly. Bradley blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Excuse me?" James stepped forward, closing the gap between them by a fraction. His voice remained calm, almost gentle. "What happens if I don't move along? Do you arrest me for standing too long in a mall? Do you search me for daring to look at shoes without buying them?" The challenge in James's words was subtle but undeniable, and Bradley felt his confidence waver for the first time. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a voice interrupted them. "Is everything all right here?" Both men turned to see a middle-aged woman standing a few feet away, her phone raised. She had been recording the interaction, her expression one of cautious concern. Bradley straightened, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you," he said. The woman didn't flinch. "I think it does," she said. "I've been watching you harass this man for no reason, and I'm pretty sure everyone else in this mall is watching too." Behind her, a small crowd had begun to gather again, their whispers growing louder. "What's happening?" someone asked. "Is it that guy from earlier?" Another voice chimed in. Bradley's frustration deepened as he realized the attention was turning against him. "We're just doing our job," he said curtly, turning back to James. James tilted his head slightly, his gaze flickering to the woman with the phone before returning to Bradley. "Is this how you usually do your job?" he asked. The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud, drawing the crowd's focus entirely. Even Davis, who had been lingering in the background, looked visibly uncomfortable. Bradley took a step back, glancing around at the growing crowd. His usual confidence had been replaced with a defensive edge. "If you've got nothing to hide," he said, his tone quieter but still firm. Then you won't mind answering a few more questions? James smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. I've already answered your questions, he said. But if you have more, go ahead. Let's see how far you're willing to take this. The crowd murmured in agreement, the tension thickening with every passing second. Among them was a teenage boy who had been watching closely. He leaned toward his friend, whispering urgently, I swear I've seen him somewhere before. Who? His friend asked, frowning. The guy they're harassing, the boy said. He looks familiar, like someone famous. Inside the store, an employee stood near the window, her gaze darting between the scene outside and her co-workers. Do you think we should say something? She asked nervously. Another employee, an older man, shook his head. Not our place, he said. Just let them handle it. But the younger employee wasn't convinced. She looked at James again, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. Outside, the crowd had grown larger and more people were pulling out their phones to record. Bradley noticed the cameras, and his frustration boiled over. All right, that's enough itai. He snapped, his voice louder than before. Everyone needs to step back and let us do our job. The woman with the phone didn't move. Your job? She repeated. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're just harassing someone who hasn't done anything wrong. James remained silent, his calm gaze fixed on Bradley. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their collective disapproval beginning to drown out the security guard's authority. Bradley's hand twitched toward the radio on his belt, but Davis stepped forward before he could use it. Bradley, Davis said quietly, his tone firm, maybe we should step back. This isn't going anywhere. Bradley turned to him, his expression a mix of frustration and disbelief. Are you kidding me? He hissed. You're just going to let him walk away? Davis hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, he said. I think we should. The crowd murmured in approval, and Bradley's face flushed with anger. But before he could respond, James spoke. Your partner's right, James said. Sometimes the best thing you can do is walk away. Bradley's glare darkened, but he said nothing. With a sharp motion, he turned and walked back toward the railing, leaving Davis and the crowd behind. James watched him go, then turned to Davis. Thank you, he said quietly. Davis nodded, his expression apologetic. I'm sorry about all this, he said. James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked out at the crowd, his calm expression betraying no hint of anger or frustration. Sometimes, he said, more to himself than anyone else, it takes moments like these to remind people of who they really are. The cryptic comment only deepened the curiosity surrounding James. Who was he? Why did he seem so composed in the face of such blatant harassment? And why did it feel like he knew something no one else did? As the crowd began to disperse, the teenage boy who had been watching earlier suddenly gasped. I know who he is, he said loudly, his voice cutting through the noise. But before anyone could ask, James turned and walked away, disappearing into the mall. The buzz of the crowd didn't fade as quickly as it usually would. The tension from the interaction between James and the mall security lingered in the air, leaving behind whispers and fragmented conversations that trailed him as he walked through the corridors of the luxury mall. The onlookers who had gathered were now scattered across various stores and seating areas, yet their gazes followed him. James's expression remained calm and unbothered, but his mind was clearly working. His pace was unhurried as he moved toward a quieter section of the mall, where the foot traffic thinned. As he passed a window display, he caught his reflection and adjusted his shirt slightly. his movements deliberate and precise. There was something in the way he carried himself, an aura of quiet authority that didn't fit the narrative Bradley had painted earlier. A subtle vibration in James's pocket broke the silence. He reached for his phone and glanced at the screen. The name displayed wasn't familiar to the gathering crowd, but it was enough to make James's lips curl into the faintest smile. He answered the call with a quiet, "Hello," his tone warm but reserved. Onlookers who lingered nearby strained to listen, though his voice was too soft to catch every word. "Yes," James said, after a brief pause, nodding slightly as if the person on the other end could see him. "Everything's fine. Just a slight misunderstanding." He chuckled softly, though there was no humor in the sound. The call ended shortly after, and James slipped the phone back into his pocket. He glanced around as though taking in the environment, his eyes lingering momentarily on a large glass atrium that opened into a high-end lounge. His expression shifted slightly, still calm, but now tinged with something deeper, almost reflective. Who was he talking to? A teenager whispered to their friend from a nearby bench. "I don't know," the friend replied, staring intently. "But doesn't he seem important? Like who just smiles after what happened?" Back near the luxury store, Officer Bradley was pacing. His frustration was evident, his heavy steps echoing off the polished tile floors. Davis leaned against the railing, his arms crossed, watching Bradley silently. "I don't like it," Bradley said, his voice sharp. "Something about that guy feels off." Davis sighed. "He's just a shopper, Bradley," he said. "Maybe we overreacted." Bradley stopped pacing and turned to Davis, his face a mix of anger and disbelief. "Overreacted?" he repeated. "Did you see how calm he was? People don't act like that unless they're hiding something." Davis hesitated. He couldn't deny that James's calm demeanor was unusual. Most people would have argued, raised their voices, or tried to defend themselves more aggressively. But James had done none of that. "What are you saying?" Davis asked cautiously. Bradley's eyes narrowed. "I'm saying we need to figure out who he is," he said, "because something tells me he's not here just to shop." Meanwhile, James had reached the atrium. The space was quieter, with only a few people seated at the sleek tables scattered throughout. He walked toward a corner booth where a waiter approached him with a polite smile. "Good afternoon, sir," the waiter said. "Will you be dining with us today?" James nodded. "Just a coffee, thank you," he replied. As the waiter left, James leaned back in his seat, his eyes scanning the open space. A group of young professionals nearby caught his attention. They were engrossed in conversation, their laughter filling the otherwise quiet area. James watched them for a moment, a faint smile playing on his lips, as though the sight reminded him of something long past. Across the atrium, a man in a tailored suit entered, his eyes immediately locking onto James. His stride was purposeful as he approached the booth. "Mr. Lawson," the man said as he reached the table. His voice was low but carried a note of urgency. "I didn't expect to find you here." The use of Mr. Lawson was subtle, but not lost on a few lingering passers-by who overheard it. One of them frowned, whispering to their companion, "Wait, isn't that—" James gestured for the man to sit, his expression unchanged. "Plans change," he said simply. Their conversation continued in hushed tones, but the body language between them was telling. The man in the suit was deferential, leaning slightly forward as he spoke, while James remained composed, his movements deliberate and measured. Unbeknownst to James, Bradley and Davis had followed him to the atrium. They stood near a column, partially obscured by the crowd. "There he is," Bradley muttered, nodding toward James. And, who's that with him? Davis frowned, his discomfort growing. Maybe it's just a friend, he suggested weakly. Bradley shook his head. Friends don't look at each other like that, he said. That guy's treating him like he's some kind of boss. Davis sighed. So what now? He asked. Bradley didn't answer immediately. He was watching James intently, his mind racing. We keep watching, he said finally, and we wait for him to slip up. The man in the suit eventually rose from the table, nodding respectfully to James before leaving the atrium. James remained seated, sipping his coffee with the same quiet composure. By now, whispers had begun to spread again. A few people recognized James from somewhere, though no one could quite place him. I swear he's been in a movie, a young woman said, scrolling through her phone, but I can't remember which one. Do you think he's famous? Her friend asked, glancing toward James. Maybe, the woman replied. But why would someone famous be sitting here alone? The unanswered questions hung in the air, adding to the growing intrigue. As James finished his coffee and stood to leave, Bradley stepped forward, blocking his path. Going somewhere? Bradley asked, his tone sharp. James stopped, his expression calm but his eyes locking onto Bradley's with quiet intensity. Is there something you need? He asked. Bradley crossed his arms. We've been watching you, he said, and you're acting suspicious. James raised an eyebrow. Suspicious? He repeated. For sitting in a cafe and drinking coffee? It's not just that, Bradley said. You're too calm, too confident. People don't act like that unless they're hiding something. James tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. Or maybe, he said quietly, you're just uncomfortable with what you can't understand. The comment hit harder than Bradley cared to admit. His jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Davis stepped forward, placing a hand on Bradley's arm. Let it go, Davis said softly. Bradley hesitated, his frustration evident, but something in Davis's tone made him pause. With a sharp exhale, he stepped back, allowing James to pass. As James walked away, he pulled out his phone again, making another call. His voice was quiet, but those nearby caught snippets of the conversation. Yes, he said. Tell them I'll be there soon, and make sure the arrangements are finalized. The cryptic nature of his words only deepened the mystery. What arrangements? Who was he speaking to? And why did he seem so unbothered by everything that had happened? James disappeared into the mall's shadows, leaving behind more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. The truth about him was far more complex than anyone could have imagined. The air in the atrium grew heavier with tension as the scene unfolded. Bradley stood rooted to the spot, his eyes locked on James. It wasn't just the crowd that had grown around them. It was the unrelenting questions in Bradley's own mind. His frustration boiled beneath the surface, fed by his inability to control the situation or make sense of James' calm, composed demeanor. The murmurs of the onlookers swelled into a low hum, the weight of their judgment starting to shift from James to Bradley. People whispered among themselves, speculating about what they had witnessed and the peculiar confidence of the man at the center of it all. Why is he so calm? Someone asked. Maybe he's done nothing wrong, another replied. But who acts like that under this kind of pressure? A third added. James, unbothered by the noise around him, turned his full attention to Bradley, his calm gaze carrying an unspoken challenge. You still haven't answered my question, he said evenly. Bradley blinked, caught off guard by the directness. What question? He asked. James took a step closer, his presence commanding even without raising his voice. What rules have I broken? Bradley's jaw tightened. Look, you're just acting suspicious, all right? He said, his tone faltering. And it's my job to make sure this place stays safe. James tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanged. Suspicious, he repeated. And what makes me suspicious in your eyes? The way I look? The fact that I've been standing here? Or is it simply because I don't fit the image you've decided is acceptable for this space? Bradley opened his mouth to respond, but stopped when the sound of hurried footsteps echoed behind him. A group of well-dressed individuals approached, reporters, photographers, and fans clutching notebooks and cameras. Their excited voices cut through the tension like a knife. "There he is!" one of the photographers called out, pointing at James. "Mr. Lawson!" The sudden recognition sent a ripple through the crowd. Conversations stopped abruptly as heads turned toward the newcomers. Bradley frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "Mr. Lawson?" he muttered under his breath. The group converged around James, their energy palpable. One of the reporters stepped forward, microphone in hand. "Mr. Lawson, can you comment on the rumors about your next project?" she asked, her voice eager. Another reporter chimed in. "Is it true your foundation is expanding to Europe? Can we get a statement?" The fans, meanwhile, pressed closer, their voices filled with admiration. "Mr. Lawson, you're such an inspiration," one of them gushed. "Can I please get an autograph?" another pleaded. Bradley froze, his earlier bravado dissolving into stunned disbelief. "Wait, what?" he said aloud, though no one paid him any attention. Davis, standing a few steps behind Bradley, suddenly stiffened. Recognition dawned on his face as he stared at James. "James Lawson," he murmured, almost to himself. He's an actor, and not just any actor. He's one of the biggest names in Hollywood, and isn't he the founder of that huge charity?" Bradley whipped around to face Davis, his expression a mix of confusion and panic. "What are you talking about?" Davis pointed at James, who was now surrounded by reporters and fans. "He's a philanthropist," Davis said, his voice tinged with awe. "He runs the Horizon Foundation. They've built schools, hospitals, shelters. He's a global icon for humanitarian work." Bradley's face flushed as the weight of his actions hit him. He had spent the entire day harassing someone who wasn't just innocent, but someone admired worldwide for his contributions to society. James raised a hand, signaling for the crowd to quiet down. The reporters and fans fell silent almost instantly, their respect for him evident in their compliance. James turned his attention back to Bradley, his calm gaze now carrying a sharp edge. "You asked me who I am," James said quietly, his voice steady. "Does it matter now that you know my name?" Bradley swallowed hard, his earlier confidence completely eroded. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice barely audible. James nodded slightly. "No," he said. "You didn't know, but you assumed. You saw a man standing in a place you didn't think he belonged, and you decided he was a threat." The crowd, still gathered around them, listened intently. Even the reporters, usually relentless in their pursuit of a story, seemed unwilling to interrupt. James stepped closer to Bradley, his tone soft but firm. "Do you know how many times I've been in this position?" he asked. "How many times people like you have looked at me and decided, without knowing a single thing about me, that I must be doing something wrong?" Bradley lowered his gaze, unable to meet James's piercing eyes. "You have power," James continued, his voice unwavering, "and with that power comes responsibility, to protect, to serve, to uphold justice. But today, you used that power to belittle and demean. You failed your responsibility, not just to me, but to everyone who looked to you as a figure of authority." The weight of James's words settled heavily over the crowd. Whispers rippled through the onlookers, their earlier curiosity now replaced by a deep sense of discomfort and reflection. "That was powerful," someone murmured. "He's right," another added. "We all saw what happened." Bradley's face burned with shame as he shifted uncomfortably under the crowd's gaze. Davis, standing nearby, stepped forward, his voice quiet but sincere. "Mr. Lawson," he said, "I'm sorry. I should have spoken up sooner." James regarded him thoughtfully. "It's never too late to do the right thing," he said simply. James turned to the crowd, his expression softening. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice carrying easily through the silent atrium. "It's about all of us, how we see each other, how quick we are to judge, to assume, to divide." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "Kindness isn't weakness, it's strength, and respect isn't something we should give based on status or wealth. It's something everyone deserves simply because they're human." The crowd erupted into applause, their admiration for James evident in their cheers. Bradley, meanwhile, stood silently, his earlier arrogance replaced by a heavy sense of regret. As the crowd began to disperse, James stepped away, his posture as calm and confident as ever. Reporters trailed behind him, their cameras clicking furiously as they tried to capture every moment. Bradley watched him go, his mind racing with thoughts of everything he had done and everything he had failed to do. Davis placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a silent gesture of understanding. For those who had witnessed the events of the day, the lesson was clear. Appearances could be deceiving, and the true measure of a person was found in their character, not their status. As James stepped into a waiting car, he glanced back at the mall one last time. His expression was unreadable, but his actions had spoken louder than words ever could. The mall was quieter now, the buzz of earlier events fading as James's car disappeared into the distance. But the echoes of his words lingered, reverberating not only in the minds of the crowd, but also in the hearts of those most deeply affected by the confrontation. Officer Bradley remained frozen in place, staring at the spot where James had stood. The weight of the day's events bore down on him, his earlier arrogance replaced by a hollow sense of regret. "How could I have been so blind?" he muttered, running a hand through his hair. His voice was barely above a whisper, but Davis, standing nearby, heard him. "You made a mistake," Davis said, his tone careful but firm. "But mistakes like this, they cost more than just reputation. They cost trust. They hurt people." Bradley looked at Davis, his expression a mix of guilt and defensiveness. "I thought I was doing my job," he said. "I thought I was protecting the mall." Davis shook his head. "Protecting it from what?" he asked. "A man shopping for shoes? A man minding his own business? You didn't see a threat, Bradley. You saw someone who didn't fit your expectations, and you made him the enemy." Bradley opened his mouth to argue, but stopped, the truth in Davis's words cutting deeper than he cared to admit. Elsewhere in the mall, the crowd had begun to disperse, but small groups lingered, their conversations filled with reflection and discussion. "I can't believe what I just saw," a middle-aged man said, shaking his head. "That security guard treated him like a criminal and he didn't even know who he was." "Exactly," a woman replied. "And that's the problem. He shouldn't have to be famous for people to treat him with respect." A young mother, holding the hand of her curious child, knelt down to explain. "You see, honey, it's not right to judge people by how they look," she said softly. "We have to treat everyone with kindness no matter what." The child frowned thoughtfully. But why were the guards so mean to him? They asked. The mother sighed. Sometimes people make bad decisions because they don't understand others, she said. That's why it's important to learn and be better. Later that evening, Bradley sat in the security office, his head in his hands. The events of the day replayed in his mind, each moment of his interaction with James sharpening the ache of his regret. The door opened quietly, and Davis stepped inside, carrying a steaming cup of coffee. He set it on the desk in front of Bradley without a word, then took a seat across from him. "You need to fix this," Davis said after a long silence. Bradley looked up, his eyes tired. "Fix what?" he asked. "What am I supposed to do? The damage is done." "An apology," Davis said simply. Bradley snorted, though there was no humor in the sound. "Like that'll change anything." "It's a start," Davis replied. "You might not be able to undo what happened, but you can take responsibility for it. And maybe, just maybe, you'll learn something from it." Bradley sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Do you think he'd even listen?" Davis shrugged. "That's not the point," he said. "The point is doing what's right." Meanwhile, James sat in the quiet of his home, the day's events playing out in his mind. He had experienced moments like this before, moments where assumptions and prejudice overshadowed basic humanity, but today felt different. As he sipped his tea, his phone buzzed with notifications. Messages from friends, colleagues, and strangers poured in, offering support and sharing their reactions to the incident. Many were inspired by his composure and his words, but some messages carried a deeper weight. "I've been in your shoes, and it's exhausting," one message read. "Thank you for standing tall and showing grace." Another said, "You've reminded me to look inward and question my own biases. I have work to do." James set the phone down, a faint smile playing on his lips. The day had been challenging, but it had also opened doors for reflection and growth, not just for those at the mall, but for countless others who would hear about what happened. The next day, James took to social media to address the incident, his words carefully chosen. "Yesterday was a reminder of the challenges we still face as a society," he wrote. "It was also a reminder of the power of kindness, respect, and understanding. We all have biases, some conscious, some not, but we also have the ability to learn, to grow, and to do better. To the security guards I encountered, I hold no anger, but I do hope this experience encourages reflection. Power is not a tool for division, it's an opportunity to uplift and protect. To everyone who has reached out with support, thank you. Let's continue to challenge ourselves and each other to create a world where dignity and respect are not privileges, but rights." The post quickly went viral, drawing praise and sparking widespread conversations about prejudice and the importance of self-awareness. Later that week, Bradley found himself standing outside a community center where James was scheduled to speak about his philanthropic work. His palms were sweaty, and his heart pounded in his chest. "Are you really doing this?" Davis asked, standing beside him. Bradley nodded, though his nerves were evident. "I have to," he said. "It's the least I can do." When James finally arrived, surrounded by a small group of organizers, Bradley stepped forward hesitantly. "Mr. Lawson," he said, his voice unsteady. James paused, turning to face him. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried a quiet intensity that made Bradley falter. Bradley began, swallowing hard. "I wanted to apologize for everything. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." James studied him for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. Then he nodded. "Thank you," he said simply. Bradley exhaled, relief washing over him. "I'll do better." he added. "I promise." James placed a hand on Bradley's shoulder, his expression softening. "That's all anyone can ask," he said. As the community center filled with attendees eager to hear James speak, Bradley and Davis lingered at the back of the room, watching quietly. James's voice carried through the space, his words powerful and inspiring. "For change to happen, we must start with ourselves," he said. "It's not enough to point fingers or place blame. We must look inward, confront our own biases, and commit to being better, not just for ourselves, but for the world we want to create." The audience erupted into applause, their admiration for James evident. Bradley felt a strange sense of hope stir within him, a hope that, despite his mistakes, he could be part of that change. As James's words echoed in the hearts of everyone present, they reminded us all of the power of compassion, understanding, and the courage to change. What would you do in a situation like this? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. If this inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that spark reflection and drive change. Together we can create a world where kindness prevails. Thank you for watching,